Pork. Pork is probably the most well-known Islamic prohibition in the world, and it goes much deeper than just avoiding a bacon sandwich. The Quran forbids it explicitly in at least 4 separate verses: 2, 173, 5:3, 6:145, and 16:115, making it one of the most repeatedly emphasized dietary rules in the entire text. And it is not just the meat. The prohibition extends to lard, gelatin derived from pigs, and any byproduct sourced from the animal, which means a surprising number of everyday processed foods technically fall under the ban. The reasoning given in Islamic tradition is that the pig is considered najis, ritually impure, at a fundamental level, not simply because of what it eats or how it lives, but by its very nature according to Islamic law. One important exception exists. If a person faces genuine starvation and no other food is available, the prohibition is temporarily lifted under the principle of darura, or necessity. That single caveat reveals something important about Islamic jurisprudence. Almost every hard rule has a survival clause built in: alcohol and intoxicants. The prohibition on alcohol was not handed down all at once. It came in stages, which is unusual for Quranic legislation. Early verses discouraged drinking, then criticized it, and finally Quran 590 delivered the definitive verdict, calling intoxicants an abomination of Satan's handiwork and commanding believers to avoid them completely. The rule does not stop at alcohol either. It covers any substance that impairs the mind, from cannabis to hard narcotics. The governing principle comes from a hadith recorded in both Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah. If a large amount of something intoxicates, then even a small amount of it is haram. That single principle closes every loophole people try to find. Whether it is a sip of wine at dinner or a low-alcohol beer, the rule applies. Contemporary scholars debate edge cases like mouthwash containing alcohol or vanilla extract, with the majority ruling that incidental, non-intoxicating traces in food are permissible, while anything consumed for its intoxicating effect is not. Blood. Consuming blood is forbidden alongside pork in Quran 2:173, making it one of the oldest and most consistent dietary prohibitions in the Abrahamic tradition. The ban specifically targets flowing or spilled blood, the kind found in blood sausage or black pudding, rather than the trace amounts that naturally remain inside properly slaughtered meat after draining. Islamic jurisprudence draws that line carefully. 2 notable exceptions come from a hadith recorded in Ibn Majah, in which the Prophet declared that 2 types of dead things are permitted: fish and locusts, and 2 types of blood, the liver and the spleen. So the organ that filters blood and the one that stores it are actually halal, which surprises most people. The broader logic behind blood prohibition relates to purity. Consuming the life force of an animal, which blood represents in Abrahamic theology, is considered improper for human consumption. Carrion, an animal that dies on its own from disease, a fall, strangulation, or being gored by another animal, is forbidden regardless of what species it is or how it looks. Quran 5:3 lists these causes of death with unusual specificity, which gives Islamic dietary law a precision that goes well beyond a simple "don't eat dead things" rule. The underlying principle is twofold. The method of death matters, and the name of God must be invoked at slaughter. A cow that dies of illness is carrion. The same cow, slaughtered correctly by a Muslim with the tasmiyah, the phrase Bismillah, is perfectly halal. Contemporary debate surrounds machine slaughter, where scholars disagree on whether a recorded recitation of Bismillah played during an automated process satisfies the requirement. Some accept it, others insist on individual human intention per animal, and the disagreement affects billions of dollars of food trade globally. Animals slaughtered in other gods' names. If an animal is slaughtered while invoking the name of any deity other than Allah, consuming its meat is forbidden, even if the slaughter itself was otherwise performed correctly. Quran 6:121 addresses this directly, warning against eating meat over which God's name has not been mentioned. The historical backdrop is pre-Islamic Mecca, where the Kaaba was surrounded by 360 idols, and meat was routinely dedicated to them at public shrines. The prohibition severed that ritual connection between food and polytheistic worship. Some scholars have raised questions about whether this applies to animals slaughtered during non-Islamic religious festivals, where a deity's name is invoked, and the majority position is that it does. The rule is less about the physical act of slaughter, and more about what that act is dedicated to, making the intention behind the knife as important as the knife itself. Predatory animals and birds of prey. The Quran does not list these explicitly, but the hadith collections of Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari do. And in Islamic jurisprudence, authenticated hadith carry legislative weight alongside the Quran. The prohibition covers all animals with fangs used for hunting: lions, wolves, tigers, leopards, and dogs. It also covers all birds with talons used for seizing prey: eagles, hawks, falcons, and vultures. The reasoning offered in classical scholarship is that predators carry a quality of aggression and impurity that makes them unsuitable for human consumption. Domestic donkeys are also forbidden based on a specific hadith, while wild donkeys are generally considered halal, a distinction that illustrates how granular Islamic dietary law becomes. Different legal schools, madhabs, diverge on some edge cases. The Maliki school, for instance, takes a somewhat more permissive stance on certain disputed animals, which means a Muslim's location and tradition can affect what ends up on their plate. Gambling. In Arabic, it is called maysir, and the Quran groups it directly alongside alcohol in verse 590, which means it received the same decisive condemnation in the same sentence. The word maysir originally referred to a pre-Islamic Arab gambling game involving the division of a slaughtered camel through drawing lots. Even the word has ancient stakes baked into it. The prohibition covers lotteries, casino games, sports betting, and any game where money is won or lost by chance rather than skill. Crucially, even winnings are considered haram. You cannot justify keeping the money just because you came out ahead. Contemporary Islamic finance scholars have extended the principle to certain speculative financial instruments, like stock options and derivatives, where the outcome resembles a bet more than a legitimate investment. The line between acceptable risk in business and forbidden gambling is one of the most actively debated areas in modern Islamic economics: riba. Riba means usury, and the Quran's language around it is startling in its intensity. Verse 279 does not merely discourage charging interest on loans. It states that those who persist in it are declaring war on God and His messenger. That is about as severe as Quranic rhetoric gets. The prohibition covers conventional mortgages, credit card interest, and payday loans, essentially the foundation of modern Western banking. In response, Islamic finance developed alternative structures: mudaraba, profit sharing between investor and entrepreneur; ijara, leasing arrangements; and sukuk, Islamic bonds that generate returns through ownership rather than interest. A hadith recorded in Ibn Majah warns that riba has 73 categories, with the lightest being equivalent, in terms of moral severity, to a man committing incest with his own mother. Islamic banking is now a multi-trillion-dollar global industry precisely because the prohibition never went away. The financial system had to bend around it. Theft and fraud. Theft is haram, and Islamic law treats it with a seriousness that goes beyond most legal traditions. Quran 538 prescribes amputation of the hand, as the had prescribed punishment for theft. But the evidentiary and circumstantial conditions required before that punishment can be applied are so demanding that classical jurists made it functionally rare. The stolen item must meet a minimum value threshold, the nisab historically approximating the value of a shield, or around 3 dirhams of silver. It must be taken from a secure place, and the thief must not be acting out of genuine hunger or desperation. The Prophet reportedly said, according to a hadith in Bukhari, that he would apply the law even to his own daughter Fatima, a statement designed to emphasize that no one is above the rule, not to celebrate punishment. Fraud receives equivalent condemnation. Deceptive business practices, short measuring, and false advertising are all treated as forms of injustice that corrupt society at its foundation. Zina. Zina covers all sexual intercourse outside of a valid marriage, premarital sex, adultery, and by extension in classical jurisprudence, same-sex intercourse. What makes the Quranic prohibition distinctive is its phrasing. Quran 1732 does not simply say, do not commit zina. It says, do not even come near zina. That come near language generated an entire legal framework of preventive measures, prohibitions on seclusion between unrelated men and women, khalwa, restrictions on physical contact, and modesty guidelines, all designed to create distance from the act before the temptation becomes acute. The had punishment for an unmarried person is 100 lashes, sourced from Quran 24:2. For a married person, classical scholars derived the punishment of stoning from hadith rather than the Quran itself, a fact that has generated significant scholarly debate about its textual basis. The requirement of 4 eyewitnesses to establish the had in court made legal conviction almost impossible by design. The punishment functioned more as a moral deterrent than a courtroom outcome. Homosexual acts. Classical Islamic jurisprudence forbids sexual acts between same-sex individuals, with the story of the people of Lot, in the Quran serving as the primary scriptural reference, mentioned across multiple surahs including 780 to 84 and 26:165 to 166. Importantly, classical scholars distinguished between the inclination and the act. Same-sex attraction itself was not treated as sinful in the traditional framework, only acting on it. The Quran does not specify a had punishment for homosexual acts directly. Different legal schools derived punishments through analogy, qiyas, with zina, which led to varying scholarly positions. In contemporary Islamic discourse, a minority of scholars are re-examining the classical interpretation, arguing for contextual readings of the relevant verses, though this remains a minority position. The topic sits at the intersection of theology, tradition, and modern human rights discourse, and the internal Muslim debate, though largely unpublicized in Western media, is more active than many assume. Shirk. Shirk, associating partners with God, is the only sin the Quran explicitly states Allah will not forgive if a person dies in that state, according to verse 448. Everything else, the text says, is within the scope of divine mercy. That single theological fact makes shirk the gravitational center of Islamic ethics. Every other prohibition exists within a framework where repentance is possible, but shirk, maintained until death, closes that door. It ranges from the obvious, worshipping idols or believing in multiple gods, to what scholars call minor shirk, which includes performing good deeds specifically to be seen and praised by others, a condition called riya, sometimes translated as ostentation. When the Prophet conquered Mecca in 630 CE, his first act was to enter the Kaaba and destroy the 360 idols surrounding it, a physical demonstration of what Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, demands. The concept of shirk also underlies ongoing debates within Islam itself, particularly between Salafi scholars and Sufi traditions regarding the permissibility of seeking intercession through deceased saints. Magic and sorcery. Seer, magic, or sorcery appears in the Quran and is classified in a hadith recorded in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim as one of the Sab'a Mubiqat, the 7 destroyers, the 7 gravest sins in Islam. The list places shir alongside shirk, murder, consuming interest, devouring orphan wealth, fleeing from battle, and slandering chaste women. Practicing magic is forbidden. Commissioning it is forbidden, and even visiting a fortune teller or astrologer to ask about the future is forbidden, with a hadith warning that doing so invalidates 40 days of prayers, according to a narration attributed to some scholars, though the exact wording and change should be verified. The Quran addresses magic directly in 2:102 through the story of Harut and Marut, two angels in Babylon who tested humans by teaching them sorcery while warning them it was a sin. Ruqya, reciting Quranic verses for healing and protection, is explicitly permitted and carefully distinguished from seer by Islamic scholars, since one invokes God and the other bypasses him, murder and suicide. Quran 532 contains one of the most striking statements in any religious text. Killing one innocent person is like killing all of humanity, and saving one person is like saving all of humanity. That verse alone positions murder as a cosmic offense, not merely a legal one. The had punishment for premeditated murder, qatal al-ahamd, is capital punishment, though the victim's family retains the right to accept blood money, diya, instead, currently valued at the equivalent of 100 camels, with the cash equivalent varying by country and legal school. Suicide receives its own specific treatment in Islamic law. A hadith in Sahih Bukhari states that whoever kills themselves with a particular method will repeat that act for eternity in hellfire, a punishment mirroring the crime. The prohibition on suicide is cited extensively in contemporary Islamic mental health counseling, where scholars emphasize the balance between forbidding the act and extending compassion to those experiencing the despair that leads to it. Consuming wealth of orphans. Quran 4:10 describes those who devour the wealth of orphans unjustly as swallowing fire into their bellies, and says they will burn in a blazing flame. The imagery is visceral and deliberate. Pre-Islamic Arabian society routinely exploited orphans, who had no legal standing to protect their inherited property from predatory guardians. The Quran's repeated emphasis on orphan rights, addressed in multiple surahs, represented a legal revolution in 7th century Arabia. The Prophet Muhammad himself was orphaned at a young age, losing his father before birth and his mother at age 6, which gives the prohibition a biographical weight that Muslims are acutely aware of. Islamic jurisprudence developed detailed rules for guardians managing orphan estates. The wealth must be preserved, grown honestly, and returned in full when the orphan reaches maturity. A guardian who dips into orphan funds for personal use, even as a loan, is in violation, regardless of intent. Backbiting and slander. Arabic distinguishes between two related sins that English collapses into one word. Ghiba is backbiting, saying something true but harmful about a person in their absence. Buhtan is slander, saying something false. Both are haram, but buhtan is the worst of the two because it combines cruelty with dishonesty. Quran 49:12 delivers what is arguably the most viscerally effective anti-gossip metaphor in any religious text. It compares backbiting to eating the flesh of your dead brother. Would you want to do that? The verse asks. Islamic jurisprudence does permit certain exceptions. Warning someone about a dishonest business partner, reporting oppression to an authority who can stop it, or a woman describing her abusive husband to a judge. These are called cases of necessity, and they prevent the prohibition from becoming a shield for wrongdoers. Slander of a chaste person, KDHF, carries its own had punishment of 80 lashes, sourced from Quran 24:4, reflecting how seriously the tradition treats reputation as a protected right. Lying. The Prophet Muhammad listed lying as one of 3 signs of a hypocrite, alongside breaking promises and betraying trust, a hadith recorded in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim that Muslims encounter early in their religious education. The Quran 9:119 commands believers to be with the truthful, and Islamic ethical tradition treats honesty as foundational to every other virtue. What makes this prohibition interesting are its 3 classical exceptions: lying to reconcile 2 people in conflict, lying in war for strategic necessity, and, according to some scholars, a spouse saying kind things to maintain peace at home. These exceptions are sourced from a hadith in Abu Dawood and reflect a pragmatic ethical calculus rather than absolute deontology. Islamic scholars also debated the concept of tawriyah, saying something technically true in a way that leads the listener to a false conclusion, as a possible workaround, with scholarly opinion divided on whether it constitutes a permissible form of misdirection or a subtle form of the very deception it claims to avoid: arrogance. Kibr, pride or arrogance, is one of the few prohibitions in Islam that operates entirely inside the heart. You can do nothing visible and still be committing one of the gravest sins in the tradition. A hadith in Sahih Muslim states plainly, "He who has in his heart the weight of a mustard seed of pride shall not enter paradise." A mustard seed. The threshold is that low. The archetypal act of kibr in Islamic theology belongs to Iblis, Satan, who refused God's command to bow before Adam, declaring himself superior because he was made of fire while Adam was made of clay. That single moment of pride, according to Islamic tradition, was the original sin, not Adam's, but Iblis's. Quran 31:18 specifically prohibits walking with arrogance or turning one's face away from others in contempt, suggesting the sin expresses itself in posture, gaze, and gesture just as much as an internal attitude. Scholars distinguish kibr from legitimate confidence. It is not pride in one's work that is forbidden, but the belief that one is inherently superior to another human being. Disrespecting parents. The Quran's architecture is revealing. In multiple places, the command to honor parents appears immediately after the command to worship God alone, placing it second on a list of only two things. Quran 17:23 instructs believers to treat parents with kindness, and then adds a detail so specific it becomes unforgettable. Do not even say "uff" to them. Uff is an Arabic expression of irritation, a sound, barely a word. The Quran forbids the sound. A hadith recorded in Bukhari and Muslim recounts a man asking the Prophet who most deserves his companionship, and receiving the same answer 3 times in a row: "Your mother." Only on the 4th ask did the Prophet add, "Then your father." The elevation of the mother reflects the physical reality of pregnancy, birth, and nursing. 3 forms of sacrifice the tradition quantifies as deserving special moral weight. Even if parents are non-Muslim or actively hostile to Islam, kindness remains obligatory. Only obedience in outright sin is refused. Cutting family ties. Silat al-Rahim, maintaining bonds of kinship, is an obligation in Islamic ethics, and severing those bonds is a major sin. The Arabic word rahim means both womb and kinship, and it shares a linguistic root with Rahman, one of God's primary names meaning the merciful. Classical scholars took that etymology seriously, treating the connection between family bonds and divine mercy as more than coincidental. Quran 47:22-23 describes those who cut family ties as people who spread corruption on earth. And a hadith in Sahih Bukhari warns that whoever severs the ties of kinship will not enter paradise. One of the most repeated traditions on this subject praises the person who maintains ties with relatives who have cut them off first, the harder and more spiritually meritorious act. The practical question of what minimum contact looks like when a relationship is genuinely toxic or abusive is an area where contemporary Muslim scholars have developed nuanced positions, generally requiring at minimum that one not be the party who initiates the severance. Tattoos and permanent body alteration. A hadith in Sahih Bukhari explicitly curses the tattoo artist and the person who requests one, language strong enough that scholars classify tattoos as haram rather than merely discouraged. The theological reasoning draws on Quran 4:119, where Satan declares he will cause people to alter God's creation, fitra, framing unauthorized modification of the body as participation in a satanic agenda. The prohibition targets permanent, non-medical alteration. Cosmetic surgery for purely aesthetic reasons falls under the same ruling in the majority scholarly opinion. The line shifts at necessity. Reconstructive surgery after injury or illness is generally permitted, and some scholars permit procedures that correct genuine deformity causing psychological harm. Ear piercing for women is broadly accepted across the legal schools. The distinction reveals the underlying principle. It is not change itself that is forbidden, but change driven by vanity or dissatisfaction with what God created, as opposed to change that restores function or addresses genuine medical need. Silk and gold for men. This prohibition is gender-specific in a way that surprises many non-Muslims and some Muslims alike. A hadith recorded in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim describes the Prophet holding pure silk in one hand and gold in the other, and declaring both forbidden for the males of his community while permitting them for the females. A man in a silk shirt or a gold necklace is therefore in violation, while a woman wearing either is completely within the rules. The prohibition extends to gold rings. Silver rings are permitted for men. The reasoning given in classical scholarship centers on preventing effeminacy and maintaining gender distinction, as well as avoiding the kind of ostentatious luxury display these materials represented in 7th century Arabia. Modern debates include white gold, technically a gold alloy, with scholars divided on whether its chemical composition changes its legal status, and gold-plated items, where the majority ruling depends on the proportion of actual gold in the plating. Music and entertainment. This is one of the most genuinely contested prohibitions in Islamic jurisprudence, and presenting it as settled would be inaccurate. The majority classical position holds that musical instruments are forbidden, particularly string and wind instruments. The primary Quranic evidence comes from 31:6, which mentions idle talk, laf al-hadith, a phrase that some classical scholars interpreted to include music, though the verse does not name instruments explicitly. A hadith in Bukhari warns of people who will make music, silk, alcohol, and other things permissible, grouping them as signs of moral decline, though some scholars of hadith have questioned the strength of its chain of transmission. The medieval scholar Ibn Hazm famously argued that the prohibition has no solid textual basis, and contemporary scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi have staked out more nuanced positions, distinguishing between types of music and context. Drums for celebrations, particularly weddings, are broadly permitted across the schools. Nasheeds, vocal Islamic songs without instruments, are universally accepted. The debate is alive, ongoing, and unlikely to be resolved soon. Wearing crosses and idolatrous symbols. Wearing a cross as a religious symbol is forbidden in Islamic law, not because the cross is inherently evil, but because displaying it implies acceptance of the belief that Jesus was crucified, a belief the Quran explicitly rejects in 4:157, which states that Jesus was not killed and not crucified, but that it was made to appear so. Wearing the cross would therefore be a silent theological statement at odds with core Islamic belief. A hadith in Abu Dawud describes the Prophet removing or covering cross-shaped images when he encountered them, establishing a behavioral precedent that scholars have extended to wearing such symbols. The question of whether a cross worn purely as decorative jewelry with no religious intent changes. The ruling is debated, with scholars generally still advising against it due to the symbol's inseparability from its theological meaning. Flags containing crosses, Swiss, British, Scandinavian, generate occasional scholarly discussion, with the majority opinion finding no issue with national symbolism where religious intent is absent. Despair of God's mercy. The final prohibition on this list is not an action. It is a state of mind. And the Quran forbids it as explicitly as it forbids pork or usury. Quran 39:53 addresses sinners directly, telling them not to despair of God's mercy because God forgives all sins. Then Quran 12:87 takes the opposite angle, calling despair of divine mercy a quality of disbelievers. The prohibition creates a theological safety net. No matter how many of the other items on this list a person has violated, the door to return is meant to remain open. Islamic ethics frames the ideal spiritual posture as a balance between two equally forbidden extremes: khawf, fear of God's punishment, on one side, and aman min makr Allah, false security that one's sins don't matter, on the other. Too much fear collapses into despair. Too much ease collapses into recklessness. The corridor between them is narrow, and staying in it is, according to Islamic tradition, the entire challenge of living a faithful life. Saying halal, meat without verified slaughter. Most Muslims buying meat from halal-certified shops assume the label is enough. It is not. The requirement for halal slaughter is precise: a living, conscious animal, a sharp blade, the name of Allah spoken at the moment of slaughter, and the blood fully drained from the carcass. Machine slaughter, pre-stun kills, and recorded audio of the tasmiyah, played over a conveyor belt, do not satisfy these conditions, according to the majority of classical scholars. Reports suggest that in many Western countries, the overwhelming majority of facilities carrying halal certification use pre-slaughter stunning, a practice that Hanafi and some Hanbali scholars consider to invalidate the slaughter entirely. Buying from a Muslim-owned shop adds nothing to this equation. The owner's faith does not transfer to the knife. The label on the package is a business decision. Whether the animal died in a halal manner is a separate question entirely, and most consumers have never asked it. Gelatin and halal packaged foods. Gelatin is in more places than most people realize, and almost none of it is halal by default. It shows up in gummy candy, marshmallows, yogurt, capsule medications, certain chips, and dozens of other processed foods, typically listed as E441 on European packaging. The default source is pork bone and skin, or the bones of animals not slaughtered according to Islamic rites. Bovine gelatin is not automatically safer, since the slaughter method of the source animal still matters. Some Hanafi scholars permit gelatine derived from pork on the basis of istihala, the principle that a substance so chemically transformed from its origin becomes a new substance and loses its original ruling. But this position is contested by Shafi'i and Maliki scholars who reject it. Most Muslims scanning ingredient lists for the word pork are missing the problem entirely, because the pork has already been processed into something with a different name. Eating at non-halal restaurants and ordering safe items. The logic seems reasonable enough. Order the fish, skip the pork, stay away from the wine list. The problem is the grill it was cooked on, the fryer oil it shared with chicken strips, and the spatula that just flipped a bacon burger before touching your salmon. Cross-contamination through shared cooking surfaces is a documented concern, and the majority scholarly position treats food cooked on equipment that has contact with haram items as at minimum mashbu, doubtful, which in Islamic jurisprudence is sufficient reason for avoidance. Some scholars permit it under conditions of verified cleanliness, but most restaurant kitchens do not operate with the kind of separation those conditions require. The social pressure to eat where everyone else eats is real, but it is not a fiqh argument. Convenience is not the same as permissibility. Music with Islamic themes. The nasheed industry has made it easy to feel like listening to music is worship if the lyrics mention Allah. The classical position is more precise than that. The voice alone is permissible. The dispute has always been about instruments, and that dispute did not disappear because the song is about the Prophet. Contemporary nasheeds regularly include drums beyond what scholars permit, synthesized instrumentals, and studio production techniques indistinguishable from pop music. The duff, a simple frame drum, is the instrument most widely permitted in classical fiqh, and even that has conditions. An electric beat sample is not a duff. The content of the lyrics does not transform the method of production. A song about paradise, built on a Haram musical arrangement, is not an act of worship. It is, at best, a complicated entertainment product with a spiritual aesthetic. Celebrating Mawlid. Hundreds of millions of Muslims mark the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal with processions, recitations, and gatherings in honor of the Prophet's birth. The scholarly dispute about whether this is itself permissible is centuries old and genuinely unresolved. The first formal Mawlid celebration is traced by historians to 12th century Irbil, and scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah opposed it on the grounds that it is bid'ah, a religious innovation without precedent in the practice of the Prophet or his companions. Maliki and Shafi'i scholars have argued it is a praiseworthy innovation. What neither camp disputes is that many Mawlid gatherings include music, gender mixing, and in some traditions, forms of veneration of the Prophet that edge toward exaggeration condemned in authentic hadith. Even those who consider the celebration permissible often acknowledge that the way it is practiced contains elements that are not. Praying with impure clothing, knowingly. Tahara, ritual purity, is not a recommendation before prayer. It is a condition of its validity. The four major madhabs are in agreement that performing salah while knowingly wearing clothing with najasah, ritual impurity, renders that prayer invalid. The prayer does not count. It does not accumulate reward. It must be repeated. The forgetful person is excused, but the person who notices a stain, decides it probably does not matter, and proceeds to prayer has not prayed in the fiqh sense at all. The intention to worship does not override a broken precondition, in the same way that intention to fast does not count if you forgot to make niyyah before Fajr. Muslims frequently conflate sincerity with validity. They are separate categories, and sincerity cannot substitute for the conditions the prayer itself requires. Giving sadaqah for show. Charity is one of the most emphasized acts in Islam, which makes it one of the most vulnerable to riyah, the desire to be seen doing good. Riyah is described in authentic hadith as a form of minor shirk, associating partners with Allah in worship, because the act that should be directed entirely toward Allah is redirected toward the approval of other people. Filming a charity donation for social media, announcing a contribution publicly so others know about it, or giving specifically because it will be seen are all mechanisms by which an act of worship becomes an act of performance. The Prophet, according to a narration in Sahih Muslim, described a generous man being among the first thrown into hellfire precisely because he gave so that people would call him generous. And they did, and that was his entire reward. The Quran describes the right hand not knowing what the left hand gives as the ideal. The camera knows, fasting, without guarding the fast. The fast of Ramadan has conditions beyond not eating and drinking, and most of them receive far less attention. The Prophet said, according to a narration recorded in Sahih Bukhari, that whoever does not give up false speech and acting upon it, Allah has no need of him giving up his food and drink. Scholars distinguish between a fast that is sahih, legally valid, and a fast that is kamil, complete. Backbiting at iftar, watching haram content on a phone during the afternoon, losing your temper with your family, and lying at work during Ramadan do not technically break the fast in the fiqh sense, but they strip it of the spiritual substance that makes it worth keeping. The hunger is real. Whether it constitutes worship depends on what the rest of the day looked like. Nikah without wali. The secret nikah has become something of a cultural institution among young Muslims who want to make a relationship halal without involving their families. According to the majority of scholars across the Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools, a nikah conducted without a wali, a male guardian for the bride, is not a valid marriage. The couple remains unmarried in the eyes of Islamic law, meaning everything they do on the basis of being Islamically married is still haram. The Hanafi position offers more latitude in some cases, permitting a woman of sound mind to contract her own marriage, but even the Hanafi position requires 2 witnesses. A private ceremony between 2 people in a room alone, with no wali and no witnesses, is not a valid nikah by any madhab. The hadith, "There is no nikah without a wali," narrated by Abu Dawud, is the basis of the majority ruling, and its chain is assessed as authentic by most hadith scholars, taking out a mortgage. The Quran's treatment of riba is among the harshest in the entire text. Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 275 through 279, describes those who deal in interest as declaring war against Allah and His Messenger. A conventional mortgage is a straightforward riba transaction. You borrow an amount and contractually agree to return more than you borrowed, with the excess going to the lender as profit. The rationalization of necessity, known in Usul al-Fiqh as darura, is real and recognized by scholars, but its conditions are strict. Darura requires that the harm being avoided is genuine, immediate, and not avoidable by other means. Renting is a means. Relocating is a means. The desire to own a home in the neighborhood you prefer does not satisfy the threshold. Islamic mortgage alternatives operating on murabaha or diminishing musharaka structures exist, though their genuine compliance is itself debated among scholars, which is a separate problem from the conventional mortgage, not a resolution of it. Insurance policies. Conventional insurance is haram according to the majority of contemporary Islamic scholars and major fiqh bodies, including the OIC Fiqh Academy, primarily because of gharar, contractual uncertainty. You pay a premium. You may receive a payout. You may receive nothing. The outcome is unknown to both parties at the time of contract, and this uncertainty over a financial exchange is what classical fiqh prohibits. Some policies also involve riba through the investment of pooled premiums in interest-bearing instruments. Car insurance mandated by law is treated differently by most scholars, falling under the darura exception for legally compelled transactions. Life insurance and elective health insurance in countries where alternatives exist receive no such exemption. Takaful, a cooperative model where participants contribute to a shared pool rather than paying premiums to a for-profit insurer, is the halal alternative, but it remains unavailable or impractical in many countries, which is a logistical problem, not a jurisprudential permission. Backbiting framed as just telling the truth. The definition of ghiba in Islamic law closes the most common escape route immediately. The Prophet was asked what backbiting was, and according to a narration in Sahih Muslim, he defined it as mentioning your brother in a way he would dislike. When asked what if the thing said is true, he replied, "If it is true, you have committed ghiba. If it is false, you have committed buhtan, slander." The truth of the statement is not a defense. The Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 12, describes it as eating the flesh of your dead brother, a metaphor that is deliberately extreme because the casual nature of the act is precisely what makes it dangerous. Comment sections, group chats, and honest conversations about mutual friends are not exempt. The subject's absence from the room is what defines the category, and their absence is almost always the precondition for the conversation happening at all, lowering the gaze. The command is in Surah An-Nur, verses 30 and 31, addressed to both believing men and believing women, instructing them to lower their gaze and guard their private parts. The hadith is more explicit. The Prophet described the eyes as committing their own form of zina, and their zina is the look, according to a narration in Sahih Bukhari. The principle that emerges from scholarly commentary is that the first glance, the involuntary one, is forgiven. The deliberate second look is not. Most Muslims are aware of this ruling in the abstract and treat it as an aspiration rather than an obligation. Scrolling through social media, watching scenes in films, and staring in public all fall within the scope of the command and are routinely not treated as fiqh matters at all. The verse being addressed to women as well as men is also frequently omitted from how this rule gets taught, making dua without halal earnings. Dua has conditions, and most people focus entirely on the form, the words, the times, the posture, without examining the preconditions that affect whether the supplication reaches its destination. The Prophet narrated the case of a traveler, disheveled and dusty, raising his hands to the sky and calling on Allah, but his food was haram. His drink was haram, his clothing was haram, and he was nourished by haram. So how, the Prophet asked, could his dua be accepted? The narration is recorded in Sahih Muslim. A person earning through interest, fraud, or haram employment, and then making earnest supplication, is not doing something that cancels the dua mechanically, but they are holding up a barrier that scholars describe as standing between the supplication and its acceptance. The sincerity of the raising of the hands does not dissolve the problem of what funded the hands that are raised. Following a madhab to avoid stronger evidence. Taqlid, following a school of law, is legitimate and recommended for the layperson who lacks the tools to derive rulings from primary sources. The problem is what it becomes when used as a shield. A Muslim who knows a hadith clearly prohibits something and continues on the basis that their madhab allows. It is in contested territory with classical scholars themselves, several of whom argued that following a school's position against clear prophetic evidence is impermissible. More common is the practice of talfiq in its blameworthy form, selecting the most convenient ruling from each madhab on different issues to build a customized religion that asks the least of its practitioner. Ibn al-Qayyim addressed this at length, describing it as following desires using the language of scholarship. The Quran in Surah Al-Jathiyah, verse 23, describes the person who takes their desires as their God. The madhab is not the problem. Using it as a menu is backbiting. Most Muslims know the word ghiba, but very few realize how often they commit it every single day. The Prophet defined it precisely in a hadith recorded by Muslim. Do you know what backbiting is? The companion said Allah and His Messenger know best. He said, "It is mentioning about your brother, what he would dislike." Someone then asked, "What if what I say is true?" He replied, "If it is true, you have backbitten him. If it is false, you have slandered him." That's the part people miss. Ghiba is not about lying. It is about saying true things that the person would dislike in their absence. Venting to your spouse about a coworker's attitude. Complaining to your mother about your sister-in-law. Discussing a friend's bad decision with another friend. If the subject would dislike hearing it, it's ghiba. The Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 12, doesn't soften the description. It compares backbiting to eating the flesh of your own dead brother, and asks, would you like that? The answer is supposed to stop you cold, slander and tale carrying. Namima is often confused with backbiting, but it is a distinct and in some ways more dangerous sin. Ghiba is speaking negatively about someone in their absence. Namima is carrying information between people specifically to cause trouble between them, even if every word you say is true. Did you hear what she said about you? I probably shouldn't tell you this, but he was talking about you the other day. That is namima. The Prophet addressed this directly in an authentic hadith recorded by both Bukhari and Muslim, in which he passed two graves and said the occupants were being punished, one for namima and one for failing to guard himself from urine. Two separate grave punishments, and tale carrying earned one of them. Scholars note that namima is particularly destructive because it disguises itself as loyalty, as honesty, as looking out for a friend. The test is simple. What is your intention? If the goal, conscious or not, is to create a rift, it is namima, showing off in worship. The Prophet said in a hadith recorded by Ahmad, "What I fear most for you is the minor shirk." When asked what that was, he said, "Riya, showing off." Riya is performing an act of worship, in whole or in part, for the attention or admiration of people. It can be obvious, like raising your voice in dhikr when guests are present, or invisible, like spending longer in ruku because someone walked into the room. It can be digital, posting your Quran recitation, mentioning your fast in casual conversation, framing a charitable donation as a public announcement. Scholars distinguish between complete riya, where the deed is done entirely for people and earns no reward, and mixed intention, where a sincere act is partially corrupted by a desire for recognition. The latter is more common and requires ongoing self-examination. The reason it is called hidden shirk is that it redirects the act of worship away from Allah, at least partially, toward the creation. The deed is still written, but what is written against it may outweigh what is written for it. Neglecting the prayer, missing a single obligatory salah without a legitimate excuse is not a minor oversight in Islamic jurisprudence. It is a sin, and scholars across the madhabs classify deliberate abandonment of salah among the gravest acts a Muslim can commit. Many people treat a missed prayer as something to make up quietly and move on from, without fully recognizing that the delay itself carries a ruling. The Prophet described salah as the boundary between a Muslim and kufr in a hadith recorded by Muslim, and the Quran in Surah Al-Ma'un, verses 4 and 5, warns those who are heedless of their prayers, not those who reject prayer entirely, but those who are careless about it. A specific warning exists regarding Jumu'ah. A hadith in the collections of Abu Dawud and Al-Nasai states that the heart of one who misses 3 consecutive Friday prayers without excuse is sealed. In an age of smartphones, work schedules used as reasons, and the Isha prayer quietly skipped because sleep came first. This is one of the most common unknown sins in Muslim households. Consuming riba. The prohibition on riba, commonly translated as interest or usury, is one of the most severe in the entire Quran. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 279, does not frame riba as merely discouraged or problematic. It declares that those who persist in it, after being warned, are in a state of war with Allah and His Messenger. That is the strongest language used against any economic practice in the Quran. Yet, in majority non-Muslim countries, many Muslims carry credit card balances, take out conventional mortgages, keep student loans, and have savings accounts that accrue interest, often without ever having been taught that these arrangements fall under the riba prohibition. The standard scholarly position holds that necessity can create a temporary allowance in extreme cases, but that necessity has a specific legal threshold that does not include convenience or the absence of an immediately available Islamic alternative. Islamic banks and halal mortgage structures exist in many countries and are increasingly accessible. Most Muslims in the West consuming riba are doing so not out of necessity, but out of unawareness that the prohibition applies to modern financial instruments, just as it did to pre-Islamic Arabian money lending. Music. This is one of the most debated issues in contemporary Islamic jurisprudence, and it deserves to be presented honestly. The majority scholarly position, held by the 4 classical madhabs, and reinforced by a hadith in Bukhari, holds that most instrumental music is impermissible. The hadith describes a people who will come at the end of times and make permissible 4 things that were forbidden, listing among them musical instruments, framing it as a sign of moral decline, not a concession. The minority scholarly position, advanced by some contemporary scholars, argues that the hadith's chain of transmission has weaknesses and that the Quran's direct prohibition of music is not explicit. Both positions exist within mainstream Islamic scholarship. What is not in dispute is that lyrics containing vulgarity, sexual content, or shirk are impermissible across all scholarly opinions. Most Muslims who listen to music daily have never been introduced to the majority ruling at all, and simply absorb the cultural norm of the society around them. Whether you follow the strict or lenient opinion, knowing that the question exists is the minimum a Muslim owes their own practice. Free mixing. Khalwa, the prohibition on an unrelated man and woman being alone together in a private space, is one of the clearest rulings in hadith, recorded by both Bukhari and Muslim. No man should be alone with a woman, and no woman should travel without a mahram. Yet in Western Muslim communities in particular, this ruling is frequently treated as cultural conservatism, rather than an actual Islamic ruling with a textual basis. Work environments, university study groups, private car rides with a non-mahram colleague, direct messaging on social media late at night. These scenarios reproduce the conditions Khalwa was meant to address. The broader principle of ikhtilat, unrestricted free mixing in social settings, has a more nuanced range of scholarly opinions, with some allowing mixed public spaces while maintaining separation and lowered gaze, and others applying stricter standards. The distinction that almost every scholar agrees on is that normalized, intimate social interaction between unrelated men and women, identical to non-Muslim social norms, is not the Islamic default. Most Muslims who engage in it have simply never been taught. It has a specific ruling. Bad treatment of parents. Surah Al-Isra, verse 23, contains one of the most precise behavioral prohibitions in the Quran. After commanding worship of Allah alone, it immediately instructs, "Be good to parents, and if one or both of them reach old age with you, do not say to them, 'Uff,' not even a sigh of irritation, and do not repel them, but speak to them with noble words." The word oof in classical Arabic represents the smallest possible verbal expression of annoyance. The Quran chose it deliberately to make clear that even the most minor display of impatience toward parents falls under the prohibition. The Prophet listed disobedience to parents among the 3 greatest sins, alongside shirk and false testimony, in a hadith recorded by Bukhari. Yet eye rolls, dismissive tones, ignoring calls, leaving elderly parents to nursing homes without necessity, cutting off a parent after a disagreement, all of these are common behaviors among Muslim adults who would be shocked to have them described as major sins. The ruling also applies, with some conditions, to non-Muslim parents. The right of parents does not expire when the relationship becomes difficult. Arrogance. The Prophet said in a hadith recorded by Muslim, "He who has a mustard seed's weight of arrogance in his heart will not enter paradise." A mustard seed. The threshold is not obvious arrogance or publicly dismissive arrogance. It is the smallest measurable unit used in classical Arabic to indicate near nothing. Kibr manifests in ways people rarely recognize as sin. Interrupting because you assume your point is more important, feeling quietly superior to someone who sins differently than you, dismissing a scholar's opinion without qualification because it contradicts your existing view, or the particularly common form. Religious arrogance, where increased practice generates contempt for those who practice less. Scholars distinguish between kibr, which is an internal attitude of superiority, and appropriate self-respect or confidence, which is not prohibited. The test is not how you feel about yourself, but how you regard others in comparison. If another person's lower status, financial, religious, ethnic, intellectual, registers as confirmation of your higher worth, that is kibr, and according to the hadith, even a mustard seed of it is too much. Swearing by other than Allah. The Prophet said in a hadith recorded by Abu Dawud and graded authentic by Al-Albani, "Whoever swears by other than Allah has committed shirk." In another narration in Tirmidhi, has committed kufr. This ruling covers one of the most widespread verbal habits in Muslim-majority cultures. I swear on my mother's life. I swear on my children. By my honor, I promise. These phrases are embedded in everyday Arabic, Urdu, Turkish, and Amazigh speech as intensifiers, social reassurances, expressions of sincerity, and most of the people saying them have no idea they carry a specific Islamic ruling. The correct form is simple. Swear only by Allah, using formulas like Wallahi, Billahi, or Tallahi. Scholars note that the hadith's use of the word shirk here indicates the gravity of directing an oath, which is an act of glorification, toward anything other than Allah, even unintentionally. Habit does not reduce the ruling. Awareness is the first step to correction. Breaking family ties. The Quran in Surah Muhammad, verse 22, describes those who cut family ties as people who spread corruption in the land and break what Allah commanded to be joined. The Prophet said in a hadith recorded by Bukhari and Muslim, "The one who cuts family ties will not enter paradise." This obligation extends beyond parents and siblings. It includes aunts, uncles, and cousins. And critically, it is not conditional on the relatives behaving well. Islam does not say, maintain ties with family members who deserve it. The scholars are consistent. The obligation to maintain Silat al-Rahim is one-sided in the sense that your fulfillment of it does not depend on reciprocity. A family member who wronged you, who is difficult, who severed the relationship from their side, you are still obligated to make reasonable effort. Scholars do allow reducing contact or maintaining only minimal contact for those in genuinely harmful situations, but outright severance without necessity, which is extremely common over inherited disputes, old arguments, and unresolved offenses, carries the hadith's warning in full: haram food and earnings. Most Muslims check for obvious haram, pork, alcohol, but the due diligence required is more extensive than that. Gelatin in sweets and medications, carmine food coloring derived from insects, shared fryers in fast food restaurants, E-numbers in processed food that may derive from animal sources. These are all areas where haram contamination occurs without it being labeled. The Prophet said in a hadith recorded by Tabarani, "Every body that was nourished by haram, the fire has more right to it." The same principle extends to income. Working in environments whose primary business involves the forbidden, bars, conventional interest-based financial roles with direct involvement in riba transactions, carries its own ruling that many Muslims in Western countries have never encountered. The standard scholars apply is not paranoia, but reasonable investigation. If halal options exist and you haven't sought them, the excuse of unawareness has limits. The obligation is due diligence, not certainty about every molecule, but also not willful ignorance when the information is accessible. Lying in jokes. The Prophet said in a hadith recorded by Abu Dawud, "Woe to the one who tells lies in his speech to make people laugh. Woe to him! Woe to him!" The humor of making up a story, exaggerating an event to absurdity, fabricating a scenario for comedic effect, these are so normalized that most Muslims would not classify them as lying at all. But the ruling is clear that a false statement made for entertainment is still a false statement. Beyond ordinary joking, there's a more serious category: making sarcastic or dismissive remarks about Islamic rulings, the Prophet, or Allah, even in a clearly humorous context. Surah Al-Tawbah, verses 65 and 66, addresses this directly. When some companions made disparaging remarks about religious matters during an expedition and later claimed they were just joking, the response was that they had mocked Allah and His verses and His messenger. The ruling is not that all humor is forbidden. Islam has a documented tradition of the Prophet himself making light jokes. The line is truth, and the other line is reverence. Neglecting zakah. Zakah is the third pillar of Islam, obligatory on every Muslim whose wealth meets the nisab threshold, currently equivalent to approximately 87.48 grams of gold, and has been held for one complete lunar year. The problem is calculation. Most Muslims who pay zakah calculate it only on cash savings, missing that the obligation also extends to business inventory at market value, money owed to you that is likely to be recovered, and gold and silver jewelry in many scholarly opinions. The Quran in Surah Al-Tawbah, verses 34 and 35, describes those who hoard gold and silver without paying what is due on it as people whose wealth will be heated in the fire of hell and branded onto their foreheads, sides, and backs on the day of judgment. The verse is not addressed to people who refuse to give zakah in defiance. It is addressed to those who simply accumulated without calculating and paying. Many Muslims in the middle and upper middle class, particularly those with business assets, are zakah liable in ways they have never been informed of and have therefore never fulfilled. Despairing of Allah's mercy. Surah Al-Zumar, verse 53, contains one of the most expansive statements in the Quran. Say, "O my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. Indeed, it is He who is the forgiving, the merciful." The word all is not a literary flourish. Islamic theology holds that no sin is beyond Allah's forgiveness for the person who sincerely repents before death, with the exception of dying in shirk without repentance. Feeling that your sins are too many, too repeated, or too serious to be forgiven is classified by scholars as a major sin in itself, because it constitutes a false belief about Allah's nature. It reflects either ignorance of the texts or a subtle form of spiritual arrogance, placing your capacity to sin above Allah's capacity to forgive. The opposite error also exists. Iman min makr Allah, false security, feeling so certain of Allah's mercy that there is no urgency in repentance or reform. Both are condemned. The correct position, described across Islamic scholarship, is the balance between fear and hope. And it tips toward hope for the one who is still alive, still able to turn back. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.